Evening, guys. Sorry about the reverb that was there. Hopefully, you're having a good night. We're getting ready for our test tomorrow. Obviously, chapters what tests we're doing 19 through 22. We'll be taking any questions you guys have. I'm not seeing a ton of them, so I'm hoping that that means that we've got a lot of people who are doing okay. For you guys, though, the test tomorrow. We'll be wrapping up the first half of our course, and so congratulations on reaching that point of your work. You guys have been doing some really good work, and hopefully tomorrow goes great for you as well. So let's get started with period 2 and your questions. The first question is from Kendall, and Kendall's asking a question that a lot of people have going into the war test that we have. What important battles are there for you to hold on to? And so in my mind, the big battles that you need to be thinking about is, first of all, strategically, you need to know about the Anaconda Plan compared to the defensive strategies of the South. As a result of that, Fort Sumter is key, the first battle of the Civil War in which Lincoln tried to hold on to all the forts in the South, and he made a stand at Fort Sumter, forcing the South to start firing at him. First land battle is going to be Bull Run, just south of Washington, D.C., and that's the one that shows that the war is going to go on for quite a bit of time. The big battles, though, turning points-wise, is Antietam, the bloodiest day of the Civil War in 1862. And we want to notice battles that have turning points or impacts that are bigger than just the military consequences themselves. So not only is Antietam one of the two Saratoga-style battles during the American Civil War, but it's also meant to create a Saratoga-style moment. It's trying to get the British and the French to jump in on the southern side. And then also, after the Emancipation Proclamation is done, after the Battle of Antietam is done, 1862, Lincoln's going to create the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the rebelling states after January 1st, 1863. In 1863, there are two major turning point battles. The Battle of Gettysburg, the invasion of Pennsylvania by Robert E. Lee. The second attempt to create a Saratoga-style battle to bring in the English and the French. And both those battles are going to fail. But with Gettysburg, you also have it followed by the Gettysburg Address and the choice of Grant and Sherman, who will march through the South trying to capture Robert E. Lee. And Grant is going to be famous in 1863 because of the Battle of Vicksburg, and that's going to allow him to become the lead general for the Union because of his work on the Mississippi River. From that point forward, you want to know about the term total war, where the North is going to aggressively attack the South in order to try to get them to surrender before the election of 1864. And then obviously the capture of Atlanta and the march to the sea by Sherman is going to be crucial to trap Robert E. Lee, and the Battle of Appomattox as well. Give me just a second. Hold on, guys. Hey, you're calling during my review session, Karen. Bye. Sorry about that. All right, so next question that we've got. Sierra, what do we need about Thaddeus Stevens? For Thaddeus Stevens, he is a famous radical Republican congressperson from Pennsylvania. He is going to be working in the House. Charles Sumner will be working in the Senate, and the two of them are guiding through legislation that will be our radical Republican Reconstruction Acts. So all the stuff that you see going on in chapter 22, when they're talking about trying to guide through laws like the Civil Rights Act or the amendments, those two guys are the ones who are actively trying to push those things through. For a survey course, there's not a lot more that you need to know about them other than Sumner is going to be involved in the caning of Sumner. But otherwise, knowing their specific names for that purpose is the only reason why they're in your textbook at this point. Let me see here. Natalie, can I explain a bit about the campaign of 1860 and the political parties? The way to picture the election of 1860... Imagine you've got a northern and southern United States, and what's going to happen is as a result of Stephen Douglas in the election of 1858 with Abraham Lincoln to try to become senators, he's going to be painted into what's known as the Freeport Doctrine, where he is asked by Abe Lincoln, do you like the idea of popular sovereignty out west, where territories and states get to decide if they're going to be free or slave? Or do you agree with the Dred Scott decision that anybody can bring their slaves out to these territories before their states, regardless of what popular sovereignty says, because a territory is open until it becomes a state? What Stephen Douglas is going to say is he agrees with popular sovereignty, that people in a territory should be able to decide that they want to be an anti-slavery territory before they ever achieve statehood, which would be against what Dred Scott had agreed to. When he made that decision, then we're going to divide into a Northern and Southern Democratic Party. We're going to have Stephen Douglas representing Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge representing Southern Democrats, and in the election of 1860, the Democrats knew they had more numbers total than the Republicans did, and so they were trying to figure out a way to split the election to get the election thrown into Congress, like we saw with the election of 1800 with Aaron Burr. It's not going to work out for them, though. Abe Lincoln is going to be able to win the Electoral College by taking votes in only northern states, and that's going to allow him to become president of the United States in 1860, triggering then secession to take place. When you take a look at the political parties, Republicans have a platform that have Whig ideas from Henry Clay and also free soil ideas like homesteading that are important to free soilers. They're adopting all the abolitionists from the Liberty Party. They're figuring out ways to bring in both know-nothing people from the North and immigrants from the North, and that's what's making them a powerful Northern party in the period right before 1860. Natalie, the after effects of the Battle of Fort Sumter are really simple. When you think about the secession that takes place, imagine the South divided in half like this. The Deep South seceded right after Abraham Lincoln got elected president. The Upper South is going to fall after Lincoln asked for soldiers to fight at Fort Sumter, and that Upper Southern split is going to lead to states like Virginia becoming part of the Confederacy. But then Lincoln's also going to be working really hard to keep the states in between, those border states that still have slavery but they're going to be part of the Union. He's going to keep them in the Union, which is essential for the Union efforts to try to win the Civil War. Kendall's got a question asking about the Tariff of 1857. Her question is whether it was before or after the Panic. Your Panic of 1853, the Panic of 1857 is going to be one that takes place as a result of the decreased prices that are coming from the end of the Crimean War. It's going to happen right at the same time that the panic is taking place, and it's going to be welcome news for a lot of people who don't want to see prices staying high. And so it's going to provide a form of relief to people who are in the crash, because they'll see prices drop since taxes on foreign goods will drop. The Republican Party, though, will make an issue about the tariff because they'll want to keep the tariff high to protect American businesses, so that then they'll be able to hire American workers and hopefully fix the economy. So each side has a reason for why they're doing what they're doing, but because it's Buchanan, who is a Democrat, who makes this decision, the Democrats during this time are much less excited about high tariffs than the former Whigs, who are now flooding into the Republican Party. Sierra's got a question. Can I explain ex parte Milligan? And I've seen a number of classes ask the same question. So the situation is simple. Think about during the start of the Civil War, Abe Lincoln is going to take over powers like martial law. He's going to impose martial law in places where the military is going to be in control, and he's going to suspend the right of habeas corpus, the right to a speedy trial. And in some places, they're going to convene military tribunals, and they're going to put people on trial in front of them who are accused of being Confederate spies or Confederate saboteurs. One of these individuals is named Milligan. That's his last name, and he is convicted of being a Confederate. He is sentenced to be executed, but then he filed a Supreme Court case arguing that he shouldn't be executed because he was tried by a military tribunal, when constitutionally he's supposed to be able to have the right to a trial by jury. What ex parte Milligan is going to say is in 1866, a year after the Civil War is done and a year after Abe Lincoln has died, they're going to argue that Abe Lincoln went too far, and that when the civilian courts are still in operation, they are where the court cases should take place, not a military tribunal where you don't have a trial but in front of your peers with a jury to try to figure out then guilt or innocence. This then protects your rights to due process when it comes to criminal behavior. For Abe Lincoln, though, he would have still felt justified for doing what he did because he felt like he was in extraordinary times. But obviously the Supreme Court is disagreeing with him and telling him that he went too far. Let me see here. I do not see any more questions for period 2, but I will come back to your class and see if we got anything else. Period 4 is next. Kirsten, hopefully the explanation of the Panic of we didn't talk about the Panic of 1857. So the question is, can I explain the Panic of 1857? And the way to picture the Panic of 1857 is you've got a classic run that's going on with farmers, where farmers had done a couple different things that got them into financial trouble. They were encouraged to grow as much food as they could during the Crimean War that was going on from 1854 to 1856. They're going out and buying mechanical reapers, they're buying as much land as they can, and they're mass producing all sorts of food. And as a result, they're going to be really productive. But before the war started, their mechanization had actually made them overproductive. They weren't finding enough buyers for their food to keep prices high, so their prices kept dropping. After the Crimean War, when the Europeans don't need to buy American grain anymore, Americans will then have an overabundance of grain. They will then be in a situation where, because grain is so abundant, they're going to see prices start dropping. And for the farmers, they're going to see prices drop at precisely the same time that they need to repay their land mortgages and the loans that they took out for their McCormick steel, McCormick reapers. So as a result, excuse me, those guys will have bank loans that they can't repay. And because of that, banks will start failing, and then businesses will start failing. The economy starts to grind down. The only place that doesn't feel that, though, is the South. They've got cotton production that's going quite well, and so they don't feel the panic the same way that the Northerners do. The next question I have here is from Sam. And Sam's question is asking if I can go into detail about the national banking system that's created in Chapter 20. And so what Abe Lincoln wants to do is he wants to recreate something that's like the bus, because he's a big fan of Henry Clay. He believes that a central bank is something that makes England powerful, recognizes Hamilton's arguments about the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have national banks set up throughout the United States. The way that a national bank will work is, let's say there's a first national bank of New Hope that is established. It's going to have specific rules and requirements for how it can do business. And the way that it's going to be working is specifically, first of all, they're going to be given the opportunity to sell war bonds. And so they're going to be selling bonds to private citizens who are then going to be funding the war effort. So the citizens are going to give the bank money. The bank is going to give the citizens bonds, and that's going to then help the government to be able to get the cash they need for warfare. So after selling the bond, they sell that money to the United States government. They get a cut of selling that bond, and all these people are in the mix for making money. What's going to happen then is that these banks are going to become incredibly valuable because they can also start circulating currency, and these things are your greenbacks. So we're going to have paper money flying around throughout the North. And the way the greenbacks are going to work is you may issue as many greenbacks as you sell bonds. So there's an incentive for these guys to sell bonds, because the more bonds they kick out, then the more currency that they're going to be able to distribute to the population. So these banks become incredibly popular, especially out west, where they're very much cash-strapped, where you've got people who want to do business, but they're far away from the governmental center. So you've got incentives for each of these states to create these national banks, and some of them are still around nowadays, or at least the storefronts that are described as like the First National, Second National, even though most of them have been bought up by like the Wells Fargos and other sorts of banks. So this is meant to be a replacement for the bus, trying to figure out ways to help control a national banking system, set up rules for banking, and then also to issue currency. Kirsten's got a question. What are the New York draft riots? When we think about the New York draft riots, they're going to happen in the middle of the war, when Abe Lincoln is going to shift his focus of the war from Union to abolition. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, he's going to be arguing that the war is now about extending new rights to African Americans. And when it comes to immigrants in New York City and other major cities, especially Irish immigrants who are worried about their jobs because they're already the lowest of the low, getting paid virtually nothing, work conditions are terrible, the thing that frightens them the most is the fear that African Americans, when they get freed, are going to move from south to north, and they're going to come steal their jobs. And so the New York draft riots is an angry immigrant riot that takes place, mostly Irish, of people who do not want to fight in the Civil War, and they do not want to be drafted because they realize they're going to be put into a meat grinder, first of all, and there's a solid chance they're going to die. But then secondarily, what they're fighting for will jeopardize then whatever little that they've built up in New York to that point. So Lincoln has to divert during the Civil War troops from the front lines to New York City to suppress those draft riots. But it's an indication that Lincoln is on very short time, where he can't fight for decades in the Civil War. He's already having people in the North decide that they don't want to be part of this war effort. Jessica's got a question asking for an explanation of the Pacific Railroad Act, and all the Pacific Railroad Act is the creation of a strategy to build a transcontinental railroad from East Coast to West Coast, and it's actually creating the nuts and bolts for getting that done. So what you saw with Stephen Douglas when he was trying to do the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that eventually is going to be transformed into the Pacific Railroad Act, where they're going to actually start building a transcontinental railroad that you'll see getting finished up in the next chapters that you move into. But it's something that Lincoln starts during the Civil War, because California had made threats that they wanted a transcontinental railroad, and they'd be loyal to whichever side, North or South, could actually deliver that to them. So Lincoln's push for a transcontinental railroad is something that keeps the Californians loyal, because they really feel isolated out in the west part of the United States with a whole expanse between them that isn't easy to connect except for by boat. Anna's question, who were the Copperheads? The Copperheads are extreme peace Democrats that are in the North, that are pro-Confederate in many cases, and their efforts are to try to end the Civil War with the election of 1864 and end up with a peaceful resolution that results in a North and a South that remain split from one another. When George McClellan is running for president in 1864, he's running as a peace Democrat. He's trying to get the votes of Copperheads, but he doesn't want to be as extreme as the Copperheads as being in favor of the Confederacy as they are. And so there's a divide within that group. But in that election, Lincoln realizes that there's a third group of Democrats. So you've got Copperheads, peace Democrats, but then also war Democrats. And the war Democrats want to finish the war, even though they were originally nervous about the conflict, and they're willing to support Lincoln. And Lincoln helps them out by choosing Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat, to be his vice president, so he can show them that he wants to unite with them. That's why he creates what's known as the Union Party in this election, even though he's technically a Republican. Anna's got a question about the Redeemers. All the Redeemers are individuals in the Deep South who are Southern Democrats who are worried that they're losing their way of life when slavery is ended and the South loses the Civil War. And they're the ones who are actively working throughout Chapter 22 to figure out ways to slow down Reconstruction, maintain the old system of doing things so that they can maintain a way of life that they enjoy. They're the ones who are trying to create what we call today the New South, where they want to create a factory system like Hinton R. Helper talked about, but otherwise they want to maintain a strict class system where poor white people and African Americans stay on one level while an elite class stays on another level to try to recreate what they had before the Civil War. Hopefully, Anna, the question that I answered earlier about Ex parte Milligan puts you into a good place. The Freeport Doctrine we also just discussed with Stephen Douglas, so if you've got any more questions, feel free to post. Harrison, I see the question about Dred Scott versus Sanford, and what we want to be noticing about the Dred Scott case is what we were talking about with the Freeport Doctrine. So in this Dred Scott case, a slave from St. Louis moved to Fort Snelling, just east of our airport, and he stayed there for a number of months, and he was living in territory, not a state. And the argument that was made was, since that territory was undefined, and since the territory was north of the 3630 line for the Missouri Compromise, and since there were all these other contributing factors, Dred Scott, when his owner passed away, he was able to work it out so he could sue his new owner with the purpose of arguing that not only should he be free, but all the other slaves who were taken by people into territories that were unaligned yet, they should also be free for being taken into Northern Territory. In this case, Chief Justice Roger Taney is going to try to figure out ways to cement slavery for the South. and they wants to figure out ways to expand out west. This is a trial that could be solved very easily, where all he needs to say is that if you're African American, you're not a citizen. And it wouldn't have been pleasing to abolitionists, but it would have been something that was totally in line with what the court had believed in the past. What Taney's going to say, though, is he's going to start with that, but then he's going to say that because slaves are property, they can be taken anywhere by their slave owner unless a state has outlawed slavery. So if it's still a territory, even if they've applied to become a territory and they've applied to become either a free territory or a slave territory, Taney is arguing that there are no such things as slave territories until you're a state. You're just wide open, and you can bring your slaves there whenever you want to. As a result, what Taney is doing is he's now opening up the West, arguing that the Missouri Compromise was illegal and unconstitutional. Any limits with that with popular sovereignty are unconstitutional. And now Southerners have a brand new system or an idea that they like the best. They love the idea of Dred Scott in the mid-1850s, because this gives them more opportunity to rush out west into territories beyond Kansas and Nebraska that are still in territory status. And so this freaks out free soilers and abolitionists and merges them all into one group. And this is going to be another motivator for the Republicans. So when you study your chapters with 19, the Republican Party is created by people who hate the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they hate the Dred Scott decision. And that's what's going to unify a lot of those very different political parties. Harrison's next question is asking about the Homestead Act, and the Homestead Act is just taking land that's out west that has not been partitioned yet and carving it up into 160-acre chunks. And when a homesteader decides to homestead, they need to stay on a chunk of land for 5 years, improve it, and then if they do that, they will either get the land for free or for a small fee after that 5-year window is done. And so what Abraham Lincoln is doing is he's hoping to deliver free soil, where these are going to become predominantly white migrants who are moving out west, who are fill up the west with small farms. 160-acre chunks is no good for plantation cotton-style farming. So he's hoping that even if the North loses the war, the West will be filled up with anti-slavery small farmers, so that there's going to be no place for the South to go out west, and they'll be trapped inside their slave territories currently. And so that's what's up with the Homestead Act, is he's trying to rapidly get farmers out west who will then also be able to supply the war effort with food and other sorts of things. Let me see here. The next question, can I explain what went down with the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the Freeport Doctrine? So hopefully what I explained earlier has satisfied your question as well. But with the Lincoln portion of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, just keep in mind that with those debates, Douglas does a really good job of hammering at Abe Lincoln, asking him, what do you actually see as the role for African Americans in civilized life after the war is done? And Lincoln's painted into a number of corners where he is going to be portrayed to Southerners as being a radical abolitionist, even though he's very careful throughout the debates to sound as not enthusiastic about civil rights as possible. So he's going to look really bad in the history book and really bad to Southerners because he is forced into such difficult positions by Douglas. But on the other hand, remember, Douglas is going to be hurt by his Freeport Doctrine, choosing popular sovereignty off of over the idea of the Dred Scott case. So both will be injured because of that, and the 1860 is a mess as a result. Harrison's next question about the Trent Affair. During the Civil War, a boat called the Trent was moving from the Caribbean up to England. It was carrying 2 ambassadors from the Confederate States to go visit with the leadership of the government of England and other European countries. The Northerners got a wind of what was going on. They captured the Trent on the open seas, took the 2 ambassadors off, threw them in jail. They are violating the sovereignty of this British boat by not asking them for permission. And when the Trent got back home to England, it led to an international incident where the British pointed out that the Northerners were essentially engaging in an act of war by taking ambassadors off of their boat, because even if the Northerners thought that these weren't a sovereign nation, the English extended to them, the Southerners, the idea that they were belligerents and gave them belligerent status and said they could come negotiate. So Lincoln had a problem. He had to either figure out if he was going to keep these guys in jail and risk war with England, or release them, but then give the Confederates the chance to negotiate with the British. And he chose that. He's going to let the ambassadors go, knowing it could be damaging for the United States, but he also recognized the war with England during this time period. So that's your Trent Affair. Let me see here. Harrison, the next question, can I explain what Lincoln did to violate the rules that limited what he could do as president? Absolutely. So the places that he stretched the Constitution is he is going to impose martial law, especially in Maryland. So he's going to set curfews, places where you can and can't travel, military rule, and that's part of what you see with Ex parte Milligan is the incorporation of like military tribunals to keep down insurrections. He is also going to suspend the right of habeas corpus. So you're not going to be able to have your right to a speedy trial if you're accused of being a Confederate spy or saboteur. You're going to spend time in jail and just be held there because you're seen as not a citizen breaking a law. You're seen as a war criminal instead. He's going to do things like start spending money from the Treasury, call up military forces, and especially he's doing an awful lot of stuff in March of 1861 because the Congress isn't in session. And so if he just sits and waits, the Confederates are mobilized. They're threatening Fort Sumter. They're going to attack Bull Run pretty soon after this moment. He really doesn't have much of a choice but to go into action using the elastic clause and other elements that allow him to stretch the powers of the presidency, especially with his war powers, to try to defend the United States. Let me see here. The next question is explain the major parallels between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. When you look at the Revolutionary War, the South is going to use the Revolution as their model for how does a smaller, weaker country resist a bigger country, especially when the goal is just independence and separation. And so they're going to use the inspiration of fighting a defensive war, having a Saratoga-style moment to bring in the English and the French. They're trying to create trade relations with allies overseas so they can get the supplies they need, kind of like the colonists did. And Robert E. Lee is going to practice the same strategies of retreating when needed, keeping his army safe, and recognizing that as long as his army stayed on the field, he could be like George Washington and serve as a symbol for resistance. So as long as he was alive with his troops, the resistance is still going on. So those are the major parallels that you see between those two wars. Let me see here. Sabrina, can you explain what the March to the Sea was and how it's important? Can I explain the difference between radical? Gotcha. So when we think about the March to the Sea, imagine that you've got this map, ignoring everything else that I've drawn on there. Sherman's March to the Sea looks just like this. And what he is going to be doing is he recognizes in 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, you now have a year before Abe Lincoln runs for re-election. And if Abe Lincoln is beaten in the election of 1864 by George McClellan, the war's over. So Sherman has to move quickly through the South, and so he's going to bring total war to the South. He's going to cut a 60-mile wide path through the South, destroying everything. And his goal in the middle of the South right here is Atlanta. If he can capture Atlanta before the election, he can show people in the United States that the war is going to be won by the North, because that's the major manufacturing center. It's a symbolically gigantic city. And so by the summer of 1864, Sherman is in Atlanta. By November, it burns. And the argument that McClellan is making as a peace Democrat is that the North can't win the war and they should quit. Once Atlanta falls, it's obvious that the war is going to be won and things are going to be all right. So a lot of what McClellan is doing with the peace Democrats is similar to what the Federalists were doing with the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention, where they were arguing you can't win the war, we should get out. And then Jackson wins at New Orleans, the Treaty of Ghent is signed. When Sherman marches to the sea through Atlanta and then to the coast, reaching the coast of Georgia at the end of the year of 1864, taking Savannah, Georgia, and then moving north. So he and Grant can pinch Lee in between. That's the big moment for what's going on with the March to the Sea. He's also tearing up all the train tracks so no supplies can get to Lee, and he can't escape south using the railroads. And that means that he is going to have to keep slowly moving away from Ulysses S. Grant, and hopefully Grant can then capture him. Let me see. Can I explain the difference between radical Republicans and moderate Republican viewpoints? Moderate Republicans in the periods of Reconstruction were interested in quickly ending the Civil War and quickly ending Reconstruction so they could move on to other things. They did believe that African Americans needed some sort of rights, but they weren't certain how far those should go. But they eventually came to agree on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that we should end slavery, make African American citizens, give them the right to vote. But beyond that, then, you see the moderate Republicans moving on to other things. They want to focus on helping farmers move out west with the Homestead Act. They want to build transcontinental railroads. They want to focus on factories up in the north. And for many moderate Republicans, they're going to feel by 1870 that plenty has been done for African Americans, especially when middle to upper income white women in the north, who also are from Republican families, are abandoning that same effort because they're now transitioning to their own moral cause of suffrage. The radical Republicans are also going to be the ones who decide that they need to impeach Andrew Johnson. And when they do that, they severely damage their case because they look very radical impeaching a president for something that's pretty trivial of just firing somebody that he didn't like in Edwin Stanton. Angela's got a question. What are the key points for the election of 1860? Hopefully my answer just a second ago helped out with that. But when Lincoln is running for election, he's trying to bring in free soilers by arguing for a Homestead Act out west. He's talking about building a transcontinental railroad. He's talking about higher tariffs to protect businesses. He is saying enough about stopping the spread of slavery that abolitionists are going to join him. So his platform is very much about trying to speak to Whigs, know-nothings, free soilers, immigrants, Liberty Party people to get them all smashed into one Northern Party. When it comes to Breckinridge and Bell, John C. Breckinridge runs as a Southern Democrat because the Southern Democrats abandoned Stephen Douglas at their convention, and they decided to run John C. Breckinridge as a Southern candidate. But again, like we talked about, not necessarily to win outright, but instead to split the electoral votes enough, and hopefully the Republicans don't win that much, so that hopefully if Douglas does well in the North, Breckinridge in the South, Lincoln does meh, they can win the election in the House of Representatives. John Bell is a guy who's part of the Constitutional Union Party, and he's running as a fourth party candidate with the idea that he wants to create some sort of Henry Clay type compromise that will keep everybody happy and prevent a civil war. And he's going to take votes in places like West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky and all these places that kind of think the same way as Henry Clay, where they've got both factories and slavery, and they're both Northern and Southern, and they recognize that if any war breaks out, theirs is going to be the middle of where the action is taking place, which is obviously not a desirable place to be in. So that's the motivation that those four different candidates have going with that election. Let me see here. Angela, the next question I've got here, what were the main ideas for the Anaconda Plan? It's a three-step plan around the United States. We're going to build a blockade, first of all, of Navy ships out in the ocean so that the South can't send cotton over to England and France and then get weapons back like the CSS Alabama or the Laird Rams. The South has what's called the King Cotton Strategy. They want to send cotton over to Europe, and when they need cotton, they'll hopefully join with the South and the South's ideas. The second part of the plan is the taking of the Mississippi River, and you saw that with Ulysses S. Grant moving down the Mississippi River, and eventually his victory at Vicksburg is going to allow that to come to fruition. And then the third part of the plan is going to be happening right here. It's going to be the taking of Richmond, Virginia, and that's where Lincoln gets so frustrated at the start of the Civil War, because he's got General George McClellan who stalls and waits through 1861. And then in 1862, he does that really bad Peninsular campaign where instead of attacking straight south from D.C. and attacking the enemy head-on with supply chains behind him, he stages this gigantic amphibious invasion on the peninsula on Virginia, starts marching inwards, and then he convinces himself he's outnumbered by Robert E. Lee. Then Lee sends Stonewall Jackson to attack near Washington, D.C., and Lee realizes that McClellan is really struggling to try to figure out what to do next. So he then gets smashed by Robert E. Lee, and eventually McClellan is going to slink back to Washington, D.C. in 1862 and not be successful in taking Richmond. And in fact, Lee feels so good about that that later in 1862, he's going to stage his own invasion up to Antietam. And just barely will he be defeated because the North is going to get a handle on his battle plans because they get accidentally dropped before the battle takes place. So that's your Anaconda Plan. Let me see here. Do I have any more questions for period 4? What are the key points to know about the reform after the Civil War? The reform after the Civil War is what you see going on with Reconstruction, unless you're talking about the Reform Bill of 1867, which is transforming England into a more democratic country that's less defined by the monarchy, and it gives more power to Parliament and a prime minister. But when it comes to reforms for Chapter 22, it is all focused on your 3 amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, your Civil Rights Acts of 1866, all these efforts by Northerners in the radical Republican groups to try to extend rights to African Americans that will legally become part of our legal framework, but also are going to be held back because of immense Southern resistance. So let me see if I got any more questions from period 4. You guys are doing great with a lot of questions. I don't see any more for period 4. Let me take a look at period 5 next. Meg, hopefully my answer just a second ago helped out with the Peninsular Campaign. Let me see. It looks like we got a question. Haley, we got what did the Tariff of 1857 do? Hopefully that went well for you. Meg, as a response to the emancipation, why did some slaves stay loyal to their owners? I would frame it in this sort of fashion. If you've got slaves who are now freedmen, and they are left with the option of going and roaming around in a place full of angry white Southerners that are really hostile to any African Americans who are wandering the roads, to the point where they could be thrown in jail, or they could be harassed, or they could be treated with vigilante attacks like lynchings and whatever. Some African Americans chose to stay on the same plantations where they had been slaves, especially because they might have had families or friends who were in that same group, and they weren't prepared to move someplace else. Your dilemma then is and this is where I kind of hesitated a second when it comes to loyalty. They're going to stay with this plantation, but not really understand that what this means is that they're going to get trapped on this plantation with a system of sharecropping that is going to work to essentially work as a new form of slavery, not technically violating the 13th Amendment, but eventually they're going to find themselves trapped because the system's going to be built up to redo what they had previously. Let me see here. Meg, you've got another question. What was the Crittenden Compromise? We're going to have a Crittenden Compromise created right after the election of 1860. So November 1860, Lincoln is going to win the election. He's not president until March. In between that time period, you've got states that are starting to secede, but a guy named John Crittenden is going to come up with an idea where he says, how about out west, we just take the 3630 line and extend it all the way out to the west coast, ignoring Louisiana Purchase or Mexican territory or whatever. If something isn't a state yet, let's just draw a line out west. Anything north of that line will be free, and anything south of that line will be slave. And they brought that idea to Abraham Lincoln, and he rejected it because he made the argument that if, after losing every single election, the losing side was able to then make a blackmail threat where they essentially said, you either give us what we want or else we're going to quit being part of the Union. Lincoln made the point then that that's going to happen with every single election. The losers are going to make threats and demands until they get what they want. And essentially at that point, you don't have a democracy. You've actually got the minority ruling the majority because of that threat of secession that's constantly looming. So instead of going that direction, he's going to refuse the Crittenden Compromise, enter the White House, try to deal with this diplomatically once Fort Sumter's going on, but then eventually we're going to end up in the Civil War, like we obviously saw in chapters 20 and 21. Let me take a look and see if there are any other questions that I have missed. Looks like period 5 is now done. No questions for period 6. Hopefully you guys are in really good shape. Sierra's got a question. Is there a chapter we should focus on more than others? I'm trying to spread out the questions between all four of the chapters, so I'm trying to treat them fairly equitably. So no, there isn't one that is emphasized more than the others. Keep in mind, though, when it comes to the Civil War, I've mentioned to you in the past that getting into nitpicky details about battles is not where you need to be. But you do need to know important turning point battles like the ones that we've laid out for your review session tonight. Let me see if anybody else has questions. Looks like period 4 is good. Period 5 is also good. Awesome. It looks like we are done. I do not see any other questions that have been posted. So good luck. Hopefully your review session goes well tonight. Last test before we go into winter break, and so hopefully you finish the 2018 strong. But I'm excited to see you guys tomorrow. Bring your notes, drop them off my desk at the start of class, and we will get rolling with your test. And then, like I mentioned on Friday, you will be playing our homesteading game, so that before you go into break, you will get the experience of being a farmer in Nebraska, and it'll be as glorious and glamorous as it sounds to be a farmer in a sod house in Nebraska in the 1800s. And so hopefully that is fun for you before we go to break. Thanks again for your questions tonight and all of your hard work. I hope you do great tomorrow. Have a